The galaxy's greatest Jedi hunter spent 2 decades searching for survivors of Order 66. He found them in temples, in hiding, on distant worlds. He pursued them with a methodical cruelty that left almost no one untouched. But the one Jedi who trained generations of warriors, who sat at the center of the Order for centuries, who knew more about the Force than perhaps any living being, Darth Vader, never came for him. That absence is not an oversight. Most assume Yoda simply hid too well, that Dagobah's swamps concealed him from the Empire's reach, that his mastery of the Force allowed him to vanish completely. It's a comforting explanation. It suggests Yoda escaped through wisdom and skill, that he outmaneuvered the darkness by retreating into obscurity. But when you examine what Vader actually did during those years, who he pursued, who he ignored, and why the pattern that emerges is far more deliberate. Yoda wasn't overlooked because he was hidden. He was left alone because hunting him would have answered a question Vader couldn't afford to ask. This is about what happens when the pursuit of a target threatens the hunter more than the prey. The accepted narrative is straightforward. After Order 66, Yoda fled to Dagobah, a remote swamp planet saturated with the dark side. The cave there, teeming with dark energy, masked his presence in the Force, making him undetectable to Palpatine, Vader, and the Inquisitors. He lived in isolation for nearly 2 decades, waiting for the right moment to train the next generation. Vader, meanwhile, hunted other Jedi. He killed Kirak Infila and took his Kyber crystal. He led the Inquisitors to temple archives and safe houses. He personally ended dozens of survivors. The explanation holds on the surface. Dagobah was obscure. Yoda was careful. The Empire had other priorities. But that explanation only works if you ignore what Vader knew. He had spent years in the Jedi Temple. He had trained under Yoda as a youngling. He knew how the Jedi Council operated, who held the most knowledge, and where the deepest secrets were kept. Yoda wasn't just another Jedi Master. He was the oldest, the most powerful, the one who had trained nearly every Jedi Knight for 8 centuries. If Vader wanted to dismantle the Jedi legacy completely, if his mission was to erase every trace of the Order, Yoda should have been the first target, not the forgotten one. And yet, for 20 years, Vader never searched for him. The first crack is the simplest. Vader knew where to look for other Jedi. When he hunted Kirak Infila, he didn't stumble upon him by accident. He researched, he tracked, he used the Empire's intelligence networks to narrow down possibilities. The Inquisitors operated the same way, through archives, through interrogation, through tracing connections between surviving Jedi. They found Jedi who had erased their identities, who had fled to the Outer Rim, who had gone silent for years. If Vader had wanted to find Yoda, he had the resources. He had the knowledge of Yoda's teaching methods, his philosophies, his preferences. He could have started with planets aligned with Jedi values. He could have scoured temple records for any mention of Yoda's retreat plans. He did none of that, which means either Vader genuinely believed Yoda was untraceable, a possibility that contradicts his relentless pursuit of every other Jedi Council member, or he chose not to look. If that's true, then something about Yoda specifically made him a target Vader couldn't afford to pursue. The second crack is darker. Vader's mission wasn't universal. He hunted Jedi, yes, but not all Jedi represented the same threat to him. Some he killed quickly, others he toyed with, drawing out their suffering. The ones he pursued most intensely were the ones who had known Anakin Skywalker, the ones who could remind him of what he'd lost, or worse, what he'd become. Obi-Wan haunted him for years, even though Vader believed he was dead. Ahsoka became an obsession the moment he learned she survived. These weren't just strategic targets, they were personal. Yoda had trained Anakin. Yoda had doubted him. Yoda had been right about him. If Vader's hunts were driven even partially by the need to eliminate his past, then Yoda should have been among the first. And if he wasn't, it's because confronting Yoda would have meant confronting something Vader couldn't survive facing. The third crack is the one that changes everything. Palpatine never ordered it. The Emperor gave Vader specific targets. He sent him after the Jedi who posed immediate threats to the Empire's consolidation of power. He tasked the Inquisitors with finding Force-sensitive children, and eliminating former Jedi Knights. But Yoda, who had sat on the council for centuries, who had commanded clone armies, who knew the Senate's inner workings and the Jedi's greatest secrets, was never named. Palpatine, who obsessed over Yoda during the Clone Wars, who dueled him in the Senate chamber, who viewed him as one of the few beings in the galaxy who could challenge him, simply let him vanish. That's only possible if Palpatine wanted Yoda alive. And if Palpatine wanted Yoda alive, then Vader's silence wasn't neglect, it was obedience. Or worse, it was fear that Palpatine's reasons aligned with something Vader couldn't acknowledge. To understand why Vader never hunted Yoda, you have to understand what Yoda represented to both men. For Palpatine, Yoda was proof that the Jedi could fall, that their order could collapse, that their thousand-year reign had been nothing more than stagnation waiting to be swept away. Yoda had led the Council through its final years of blindness, arrogance, and failure. He had failed to sense the Sith's return until it was too late. He had trusted the clones. He had allowed Anakin to fall. Killing Yoda would have been a footnote, letting him live, letting him rot in exile, knowing his order was gone and his life's work had amounted to nothing that was a victory Palpatine could savor every day. Yoda wasn't a threat in hiding. He was a monument to the Jedi's irrelevance. For Vader, the calculation was more fractured. Yoda had been one of the few Jedi who had consistently doubted Anakin, not out of malice, but out of something worse, clarity. Yoda had sensed the darkness in him early. He had warned the Council. He had counseled Anakin to let go of his attachments, to accept loss, to surrender the very thing that had made Anakin who he was. When Anakin ignored that advice and fell, Yoda's silence became unbearable. It wasn't judgment, it was inevitability, as if Yoda had known all along that Anakin would choose wrong and had simply been waiting for it to happen. Hunting Yoda would mean facing the one Jedi who had never been surprised by what Anakin became. And that would mean confronting the possibility that Anakin's fall wasn't a tragedy, it was a foregone conclusion, that the Jedi hadn't failed him, that he had simply failed. Vader couldn't allow that question to exist, not consciously. So instead of hunting Yoda, he hunted others. He hunted Jedi who had loved Anakin, who had trusted him, who represented versions of himself he could still justify destroying. Obi-Wan was a betrayal. Ahsoka was a reminder of innocence lost. But Yoda was the one who had seen Anakin clearly from the beginning and hadn't intervened because intervention wouldn't have mattered. If Vader found Yoda, he would have to duel him. And if he dueled him, Yoda would speak. Not to plead, not to appeal to Anakin's remaining goodness, but to state, with the same calm inevitability he'd always carried, that this was always what Anakin had been. That the galaxy hadn't been saved from Anakin Skywalker, it had been saved from who Anakin had always been becoming. Vader needed the lie that he had been betrayed, that the Jedi had failed him, that Padme's death had forced his hand. Yoda's presence would strip that lie away, not through argument, just through existence, through the simple fact that Yoda had known and had done nothing, because nothing could have been done. Palpatine understood this. He understood that Vader's power relied on a specific kind of pain that justified itself, pain that could be weaponized, pain that never resolved. Yoda threatened that pain, not by redeeming Vader, but by revealing that Vader's suffering had been voluntary all along. That every choice, killing the younglings, hunting the Jedi, serving the Empire, had been made by Anakin, not forced upon him. So Palpatine never sent Vader to Dagobah, not because he didn't know where Yoda was. The implication becomes hard to ignore. Palpatine always knew. He had resources Yoda couldn't have evaded forever. He had scoured the galaxy for Force sensitives far less significant. If Yoda had truly been a threat, Palpatine would have sent a fleet, an army, 100 Inquisitors. He sent no one, which means Yoda's exile served the Empire better than his death ever could. Every day Yoda spent alive, hidden, waiting in that swamp, he proved the same thing. The Jedi's time was over. Their greatest master couldn't even show his face. And Vader, whether he admitted it or not, needed Yoda to stay hidden. Because the alternative, confronting him, hearing his voice, seeing that calm, knowing gaze, would mean facing the one truth Vader had spent 2 decades burying, that he hadn't been turned. He had chosen. The cost of this unspoken arrangement was asymmetrical. For Yoda, exile meant isolation. It meant training no one, guiding no one, watching the galaxy burn while he meditated in silence. He waited 20 years for Luke, but that wait wasn't strategic, it was enforced. He couldn't act without exposing himself. He couldn't intervene without risking the one thing the rebellion needed: hope that the Jedi weren't entirely gone. His survival wasn't a victory, it was a prison sentence. For Vader, the cost was subtler. Every Jedi he killed brought him no closer to peace. Every hunt ended with the same hollow satisfaction, another name crossed off a list, another fragment of his past destroyed, but nothing inside him changed. He pursued Obi-Wan across years, but when he finally faced him on the Death Star, the confrontation didn't resolve anything. It only confirmed that Vader's rage had no endpoint, that no amount of killing would undo what he'd done. Yoda was the one target whose death might have meant something, not because it would redeem Vader, but because it would force him to face the question he'd been avoiding, whether any of this had been necessary. And Vader couldn't survive that question, so he avoided it. He turned his attention to lesser threats, to younger Jedi, to targets who didn't know him well enough to see through him. He let Palpatine dictate his mission, knowing that Palpatine would never send him after Yoda, because Palpatine understood what Vader couldn't admit, that the real threat wasn't Yoda's power, it was Yoda's clarity. The rebellion benefited from this silence in ways they never understood. If Vader had hunted Yoda, if the Empire had committed resources to finding him, Dagobah might have been discovered years earlier. Luke might never have been trained. The last true Jedi Master might have died alone, unmourned, with no one to pass on his knowledge. Instead, Yoda's exile became a kind of preparation, not because he planned it that way, but because the Empire's refusal to pursue him created the space for one final student. But even that came at a cost. Luke arrived on Dagobah expecting to find a warrior. He found an old creature who had been waiting so long he'd almost forgotten what he was waiting for. Yoda's teachings were sharp, but they carried the weight of someone who had watched his entire legacy collapse, who had stood at the center of the Jedi Order and seen it destroyed not by the Sith's power, but by its own blindness. When he told Luke, "You must unlearn what you have learned," he wasn't just talking about Luke's impatience. He was talking about everything the Jedi had gotten wrong. If Yoda had been hunted, if he'd spent those years fleeing instead of meditating, he might not have arrived at that understanding. The Empire's neglect gave him time to reflect, to see the Order's failures clearly, to prepare a teaching that wasn't about restoring the Jedi, but about building something better. But it also meant that Luke was the only one who received that teaching. No other Jedi survived to hear it. No other student carried forward Yoda's revised understanding of the Force. The very thing that saved Yoda's knowledge also ensured it would nearly die with him. And Vader lived with the absence. Every Jedi he killed, he checked the list. Every hunt concluded, he moved to the next. But Yoda's name never appeared. Not in mission briefings. Not in Palpatine's orders. Not in the Inquisitor's reports. The silence around Yoda became its own kind of presence, a reminder that some confrontations were too dangerous to initiate, even for a Sith Lord. When Vader finally died, redeemed in those last moments aboard the Death Star, he never faced Yoda, never heard his voice again, never had to answer for what he'd become. Some might call that mercy. Others might see it as the final proof that Vader's redemption was incomplete, that he died without confronting the one person who had always known the truth about him. Yoda outlived Vader by minutes. He passed into the Force just after confirming that Luke was ready, that the Jedi could continue, that his exile had not been in vain. But he never knew that Vader had spent 2 decades avoiding him. He never knew that his survival had been a deliberate choice made by the Empire, that Palpatine had seen more value in his suffering than in his death. He died believing he had hidden successfully, that his isolation had been his own doing. The truth was darker. His isolation had been allowed, and the man who became Darth Vader had spent 20 years ensuring they would never meet again, not because Yoda was too weak to hunt, but because he was the only one strong enough to make Vader question what he'd become. If the Empire had truly wanted to erase the Jedi, Yoda would have been the first target. That he was the last one left standing raises a question no one in the Empire ever answered aloud. What if letting him live was the cruelest thing they could have done? If you want more Star Wars truths that are rarely examined, you know where to find them.